Okay, forgive me, I'm still sick, but I thought it was important to try to make this sooner rather than later to try to address this issue while it's fresh on people's minds. So basically, I was asked the question, is there schism in the Eastern Orthodox Church? To which the answer is yes, there absolutely is. And there are defenses that the Eastern Church will make to say no, that we're unified, that we're sure there's problems, but it doesn't mean the church itself is broken in two. And I just wanted to make it clear exactly what's going on so people can get a better idea of how communion actually works in the East. So here's the big issue to start. We've got Bartholomew, who is the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. He's the first amongst equals. If there was like a main guy in Orthodoxy, it's this guy. So, okay, we have him. Then we have the Moscow Patriarchate, or the Russian Orthodox Church. This makes up half of all of Eastern Orthodoxy, and this is your, it's not exactly like a pope. He doesn't have nearly that kind of authority, but he is, again, this first amongst equals, the guy with a couple extra special privileges. These two are in schism with each other. They do not share communion. I'm sure the lay people do, because I'm sure they don't care, but the churches themselves have properly broken communion with each other. So that's immediately a big deal because, again, you have half of the church and then the main guy. So again, this is an issue. And this happened because Bartholomew granted autocephaly to a Ukrainian Orthodox church body, not an independent like parish, but a body of the church. Said, you guys are free to operate on your own, whereas Russia said, no, that's our area, that's our jurisdiction, you can't do that. So now we have these two separate, again, they'll say it's all part of the same church, but we're getting to that. These two kind of floating, ambiguous Ukrainian churches, and no one can really tell which one the actual Ukrainian Orthodox Church is. It kind of depends on whose team you're on up here. Because again, Bartholomew's going to look at the Russian option and say, well, no, we granted autocephaly to this one, so they're the canonical ones. But Russia will look at this one and say, no, Bartholomew didn't have the right to do that, so we don't recognize them. So we already have these three broken lines where there is no real unity between these groups. So I would look at that and say the church is split in half. And I think I'm right to believe that, but what will happen is they'll say no, because Russia and Bartholomew are both unified through a mutual communion that is intact, with a church like Antioch being what seems to be the most popular example, because it's another one of the bigger, more ancient patriarchates. Okay, maybe there's something there, and there is. This is a real communion that exists. Russia is in communion with Antioch the same way Bartholomew is. Cool. You could say that there's unity there. But I think there's a bigger problem at play. Antioch communes with the Syriac Orthodox Church. And I get it. Like, that doesn't seem like a big deal on the surface. It's just another Orthodox church. Until I tell you that the Syriac Church is Oriental Orthodox, which by the definition of the Eastern Church are heretics because they don't accept all the same ecumenical councils. They have a Christological difference in their theology. So according to the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Syriac Church are Christological heretics. And yet these two will commune with each other on almost all scenarios and almost all circumstances. Now, yeah, there's been ground made lately of arguing maybe this is just a linguistic issue and we don't actually disagree, and that's great. Maybe a more solidified unity will happen here. But the point I'm trying to make is that the church that these guys are claiming for unity communes with a church who's not even Eastern Orthodox. So is this really a great point of unity now, when this relationship here itself communes with someone completely outside of the church, whereas these two won't even commune inside the church? That's a really wild issue. And can you really say, well, we're unified through someone who communes a heretic? That's a wild issue, because Russia doesn't commune with these guys. Bartholomew doesn't commune with these guys. So this is what you're trying to glue it all together with? And yes, there's plenty of other patriarchates who I could have put here, but they're smaller, they have less of a historical precedent. And regardless, this is still a relationship that both of these guys have with this church, and this church still does this. So people in communion are communing with people out of communion with the whole church. It's a disaster house. It's a complete mess from what you can see. It really, trying to place Antioch in this position is like trying to hold a house together with like Elmer's glue. It doesn't work. And it gets worse, because Russia, again, not quite this cozy, but Russia has this kind of wibbly-wobbly relationship with the Coptic Church, who are also Oriental Orthodox. So, okay, we have another weird dialogue here with a church completely out of communion, which, fine, so be it. Again, maybe there's some good progress being made with the Oriental churches. That'd be great. We would love to see more unity. But the problem is Russia's usually the ones who are very sectarian, who are anti-ecumenist. So to start seeing these dialogues is pretty out of character for the Russian church, especially if they're the ones getting soft on their terminology. Because they'll gladly welcome anyone back into communion with them on their terms. So if Russia starts softening their language to allow for other churches into communion, we're starting to get away from their historic position. Especially when Russia, and I see this all the time, the Russian church is constantly getting after Bartholomew because of his coziness with Rome. Pope Francis. So again, like, there's a relationship that doesn't seem to exist here. There's a huge problem here because, the Russian church has no interest in reunification with the Pope, and yet Bartholomew does. Look at how many lines have X's through them or are wibbly-wobbly half communions. Again, that one's a lot more solid, but you get my point. There's so much more disunity than there is unity. And this continues to get worse the further I draw it. I could say, for example, you see a lot of examples of Antioch and Bartholomew. I'm using Bartholomew as an example of the Greek church in general, but these guys get really cozy with world religion in general. I'm talking Islam. I'm talking Buddhism. I'm talking the Archbishop of Canterbury. Not that Anglicans are a different religion, of course, but they're certainly not Eastern Orthodox. And they'll have these prayer summits where they will get together and they will pray together and kind of recognize each other in some ways. And again, ecumenism is a sin in Eastern Orthodoxy, and Russia sees that, and I see this all the time. The Russian guys see that, and they'll call Bartholomew a heretic. They'll call the Greek church heretics. They'll call the Antiochians heretics for their coziness and their willingness to pray with just world religion in general. So that's an even bigger issue there. All the while, Russia itself has been the victim of political games for ages. And because of certain issues with the Soviet Union, there have been other Russian bodies that haven't even been fully in communion for certain reasons. Like one big one that I think of is ROCOR. And again, typically us, when we're dealing with Orthodox people online, are usually ROCOR members. ROCOR tends to be the most sectarian, elitist kind of Orthodox that are in communion with the greater body. They are in communion, at the very least, with Russia. And yes, they're in communion with others too, but they don't like it, it seems. Their attitude towards the other churches is very negative. I've even heard some ROCOR guys say that they don't really even like the Russian church. They're very much their own thing, which is evident by the fact that ROCOR was actually a schismatic church. They weren't even in full communion with Greater Orthodoxy up until fairly recently. You also see other kind of semi-autocephalous independent churches like the Orthodox Church in America that also has Russian roots and yet doesn't report to the Russian Patriarchate, nor are they a part of ROCOR. They're autocephalous. They kind of operate on their own. And because of some of these weird governmental reasons, ROCOR often looks at the OCA and says that they are non-canonical. Now, it's not a proper break in communion, but it's this general understanding that the OCA isn't a canonical church for one reason or another. So you even have these like weird non-patriarchal floating churches that don't get along with each other and don't see each other as valid in some cases. Again, like, this is a unified church? Like, I can't see it. Man, again, I can keep going. For example, if I made this video last year, there'd be another huge excommunication between the Patriarch of Jerusalem and Antioch. They were out of communion for the last decade and only came back into communion this last year with each other. They restored communion with each other. And again, the Patriarch of Jerusalem is part of the Greek church, so again, this falls into this issue of like world religion, and the Russians don't like that. And there's no way I could draw this any more simply than it's laid out in front of you right now. And again, sure, you've got a bunch of other little patriarchates that are less historically founded or are very, very small churches that you could say share communion kind of in place of Antioch. But it doesn't change the reality of these relationships in front of you. Like, sure, I could say there's, a number of other patriarchates that aren't doing this silliness, but it doesn't nullify everything that's happening here. All of the breaking communions here. There's also talk of Bartholomew trying to properly reunify with Rome. I might have mentioned that, but again, I can't stress what a massive deal that would be if that happened, because that implies one of two things. The Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople falls out of the Eastern Church entirely and is absorbed into the Roman Church, which then your first amongst equals thing kind of flies out the window because that's your main dude. What happens to the rest of the church then? It falls into chaos, really, is what ends up happening. So again, I don't illustrate it this way to poke fun or to seem like I enjoy this. I would love nothing more than for all of Christ's church to come back together into one big happy family. But for the Eastern Orthodox Church to call themselves one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, I don't know how you look at this and come to that conclusion. So I hope that was helpful.